and pass over. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Brett. Hello, everybody. So a little while back, Brett had asked whether I might do a seminar with Lianne on earthquake recovery lessons for the current cyclone and then beyond. I held back a little bit because, well, I'm certainly not affected in the same way that I was in Christchurch. Not really for me to speak on what's going on in Hawke's Bay. I'm not there. And to my view, recovery really depends on local knowledge. And I don't have that in that case. But what we do have is a bit of knowledge from Christchurch that might apply in other disasters. So I'd done a report about 5 years ago now with Bryce Wilkinson looking at some of the lessons from Christchurch. And Lianne Dalziel, who was mayor of Christchurch in much of the recovery phase, wrote the foreword for that report. So rather than do a webinar on it, I thought, oh, who would I really want to talk to about the lessons from Christchurch? And, well, why should I just do that as a phone call? We could just do it as a Lianne seminar and other people could listen in, tell us that we're all out to lunch if we happen to be afterwards in the chat session. But I thought it made more sense to do it as sort of a public conversation. So in my view, there are a few key sorts of lessons out of Christchurch, and I'd like to test some of these with Lianne and then just ask a few questions and bounce ideas around. So for me, one of the main lessons out of Christchurch was the messes that you get into when you go away from local knowledge and local decision making and have sort of top-down approaches to recovery. So in Christchurch, we had first the Christchurch Development Unit that sought to impose a central plan over the central city, regardless of local knowledge and local preference. The Christchurch Recovery Agency that was more Wellington talking to Christchurch about what should be done than about helping Christchurch to get around some of the problems that were caused by central government legislation, central government regulatory programs, things that obviously needed to be changed in response to a natural disaster that required central government facilitation. That didn't seem to be the point of CIRA. So, Lianne, what were you taking as the lessons out of Christchurch? Was that based similar issues, or were there other bits that I've missed?
There are quite a number of lessons out of Christchurch, but I've developed this habit of saying that lessons are not learned until they are embedded into practice. And I don't think that we've quite got to the point of embedding into practice some of the lessons that we have learned along the way. Your identification of the top-down model that was chosen for Christchurch is my fundamental disagreement with the approach that was adopted. I think that after a disaster, you want to be really looking at what the local structures are, because actually government is going to be involved and government is going to ultimately leave. So how does government inject itself into the local environment and then leave the local environment in a better position, in a stronger position, in a more resilient position than it was before the disaster happened? And I think this was a major failing by setting up a government department. We'll send you in to recover the city of Christchurch and then we'll pull you out. That doesn't build the kind of resilience that I think that these disasters all give us the opportunity to look to build. And I'll just I'll finish on another note, because I did want to acknowledge the people in the Hawke's Bay and Auckland and further north and Gisborne, Tairāwhiti, and I know that I've left somebody out, but you know, our hearts and minds are with you all as you struggle through what is going to be a very difficult few years yet to come.
Yeah, absolutely. It was more out of respect for their situation that I didn't want to be bringing that in directly, because I'm not there. I don't have standing to talk about it, for exactly the same reason that we worry about central government or some guy sitting at a desk in Wellington saying what things are in Hawke's Bay. We don't know. It should be for them. So completely agree. Now, one of the tensions that central government seemed to find itself in the case of Christchurch was, at least, well, prior to your coming in under Mayor Parker, there seemed to be a bit of dysfunction in Christchurch Council. So one of the lessons that we'd come to in our report was that any central government response should be sensitive to some of the, well, sort of the capacity constraints that seem to be operant at the local government level. So ideally, you're in a spot where central government can take on only a facilitation role and talk with the community, find what the barriers are that central government might be able to ease and otherwise defer to locals. But if you're in a spot where council is almost dysfunctional in some aspects, it might need a more heavy-handed role. How do you see that tension being able to be resolved?
I think it's central government coming in, and I am seeing it with the government up in the North Island. They are talking about regional recovery far more than we heard after the Canterbury earthquake. So we're getting the language really focused on the fact that there are a number of different regions that have been affected in different ways, and the way that they will recover will require different approaches. And I noticed that Hawke's Bay have set up their recovery board yesterday, I think it was. So I'm pretty excited to see that they've taken the bull by the horns. They've developed an approach that brings some pretty good people together in a board that will provide that governance oversight and really support to the city and the district's mayors and chairs as they work through all of those processes. So that has been a much better approach. I think that the words that I use are capacity building. So if central government comes in with a view to building capacity, then you start to think of central government as a partner and a facilitator, a supporter, working along those lines. That's a much better place to start. So I think if in Christchurch they'd started from a let's build capacity in the second largest city in the country, how do we build that capacity? Then coming in and taking over and doing the job isn't the way to do it.
Yeah, you can see why central government would be tempted in that direction, though, right? So if they're looking at it, we're in an emergency. We've got a whole pile of things that need to be done in a really big hurry, and rebuilding central or local government capacity is kind of a long-term project.
Sure.
They can be tempted to move a little bit more quickly. I'm curious about some of the dynamics then within council. So I was living in Christchurch at the time. It seemed like a lot of the Christchurch council functions that weren't directly related to the earthquake response were kind of kept on an autopilot that was set well before the earthquake. So they did not seem to have gotten the memo, as you put it in some other writing. So one case that had really annoyed me was that, well, in the economics department of Canterbury, we had been trying to get some easing of zoning restrictions so that people could have secondary suites. And the Christchurch planning officer just wouldn't do it, right? So the granny flats that are common all over Wellington were illegal in Christchurch, and would have been the dead simplest thing for enabling a faster recovery, getting some housing built. What do you think leads councils to operate that way in a crisis? Is it just that, well, everything's awful, you stick with what you're familiar with because thinking beyond that is just too terrible? Is it something else? What was your experience in there?
Oh, well, it was I wasn't there at the time
I know.
of the earthquakes, but my frustration that you've obviously read me express on other occasions was this early return to business as usual after the September earthquake. But I think the September earthquake gets forgotten because of the tragedy of the February earthquake. And I think that a lot of people think that decisions were made very quickly, particularly around land use, the red zoning, which is not a phrase that I would choose, but those decisions were made very quickly. But I really want to remind people that actually the decision making that was enabled actually started after the September earthquake. So all of the land damage assessments that were done after the September earthquake, which were designed to facilitate the general public to be able to get on with rebuilding and repairing their properties, they were looking for areas that they called green zones. And the green was really the green light. You can get on and rebuild. You don't need to do a land assessment before you rebuild your house, because you are on good ground. And so all of that work that was done, so it was nearly 6 months before the February earthquake, and all of that work that was done was able to be then fed into a new model, which again looked at which areas could be rebuilt quickly, which required more detailed foundation support, and they were the orange zones that ultimately had a TC rating attached to them, TC2 or TC3, and they had foundation types that were attached to them. And then the red zone, and as I say, I'm sure they regret it, but it was only a traffic light system. It wasn't to say that it was dangerous or couldn't be rebuilt. It was just the amount of time that it would have taken to rebuild that number of sections within that number of subdivisions. So it really was, it was seen a different way from what it was intended to be. But it did mean that there was a lot more time and energy going at the front end on land assessments. And I suspect that might be what they're focused on in the North Island as well. But the North Island is totally different from the South Island in the sense of Christchurch, because ours was largely an urban rebuild. And in the farming areas, there are a whole lot more issues that are going to have to be considered. And it isn't going to be a straightforward or a straight line recovery process, because each area is going to have its own challenges. So what we see laid out before us at the moment is actually quite different from what we had in Christchurch.
Yeah, that's all really important, the zoning decisions, and you've talked in a couple of columns about some of the perils of red zoning and people mistakenly thinking that it's a very simple process that just can sort things. I want to come back to that, but I was thinking more directly about regulatory processes within council that might have been fit for purpose during pre-quake times.
No. Yeah.
Obviously needed to be changed in a post-quake environment, and nobody pulled the lever.
Yeah,
Like,
the trauma of business as usual. No one got the memo. That was that business as usual became rebuilt into the way the council operated before the end of 2010. So they'd had a significant earthquake event.
Yeah.
All of the evidence showed that there was likely to be a significant follow-on event. The fact that it happened in February meant that it was later than people would normally predict in an earthquake sequence. But the probability of it occurring was still relatively high once we hit February. So they reverted to business as usual and not the recovery approach that they should have put in place way sooner than they should have.
One of the lessons that we'd drawn from it was that there should be some contingency planning within council, so that there is an automatic lever that could be pulled where you identify in advance the bits of legislation or council regulation that might not be quite fit for purpose come an event, so that when you have the event, you pull the lever and, all right, land that you know is good now has higher density allowed in it so that people can start rebuilding. If you've lost a whole pile of houses, for example, have we seen council starting to move towards that, or is preparedness still a little weaker than we'd expect?
No, and I've watched with interest the release of the report into the Auckland response, and I think that just reminds us how significant it is that we all do scenario planning, whether it's at the local government level or at the central government level, whether it's regional, but definitely across agencies. So I think that's just been a rock solid reminder of how important it is to do that work. But no, I don't think that work has been done. And I mean, in some respects, I think that the government of the day did want to build in some sort of emergency preparedness into the regulatory framework so that certain rules could be changed. But I think that instead of actually analysing all of the changes that were made by Order in Council after the Canterbury earthquake and then identifying whether some changes to the legislation could be made so that you don't end up with this Henry VIII abomination, as a lot of us legal people tend to refer to it as, rather than end up with having to pass legislation that gives the power by regulation, so secondary delegated legislation, to amend primary legislation. It should really be the exception, not the rule. And so I think a lot more work could have been done in the meantime to actually structure some of the regulatory frameworks. And actually, and I know that you and I agree on this matter, we don't agree on everything, but I know that you and I agree on this, is that if the regulatory framework is not appropriate for the business not as usual, is it actually appropriate for the business as usual as well? And that is the sort of work that I would have liked to have seen happen. I'm a great believer in reviewing legislation after it's been in place, particularly large regulatory reforms. I was involved in the regulatory reforms after the finance company failures. And it was actually across party lines. I worked very collaboratively with the opposition spokesperson on commerce at the time, when I was the minister, Simon Power, and then he worked very collaboratively. I became the chair of the Commerce Select Committee and took through the legislative framework that he put in place. But I always wanted to have not a sunset provision, but a review provision written into the Act so that we could actually not let it get out of date after having made such significant changes. And I think this particular area of emergency management, I think it's ripe for that sort of approach.
Absolutely. And we do agree here. Our report had suggested having off-the-shelf legislation ready in case of an emergency so that you've got all of the time necessary for democratic deliberation over it, for the law experts to go through and make sure that you've not created great big problems for yourself, not set bad precedents, not given undue power to people who are not particularly accountable. Getting all of that right when you're not in a big hurry after an emergency makes it a lot easier after the emergency. We've been thinking about it as frameworks for recovery agencies, and I'm pretty happy that they've not gone down the recovery agency model this time, but it also obviously applies for enabling legislation. Now, I completely agree also that some legislation that isn't fit for purpose during emergency times probably isn't fit for purpose during normal times.
May not be.
But there will be bits that some processes just aren't worth the extra time in response to an emergency, getting those set out ahead of time with a legislative framework. And I think we've seen consequent to some of the pushback on the current legislation, sort of greater consensus on that this ought to be dealt with before the next one so that we've got off-the-shelf legislation ready. It seems to be one of these areas that's never a pressing concern until it's a deeply pressing concern, so it gets ignored.
No, now, I'm sure that there are a lot of people, particularly those who are involved in Christchurch, who'd be really willing to commit time and effort into helping get such a process off the ground. And I mean, I know that some of the people that were involved in the SCIRT program, which was a very successful alliance model. So, you know, not everything that happened down here I'm sort of criticizing, because actually there were things that went very well. But the SCIRT program, I know that a lot of the people that were involved in that have been doing some thinking about having a model. You know, they've called it Engage, but it's a model that you can basically lift and shift, and it supports whichever area is going through a situation like that. But more importantly, it becomes the conduit for engagement with central government as well, because often it'll be multiple central government agencies, and actually having somebody that can then translate that into a meaningful way of communicating with the local and regional communities would be very, very good. So I think the time has come to put all of these ideas on the table and to have it sorted out for the future.
I think they've come to a pretty reasonable solution in this case, or at least it looks like that from my desk in Wellington, and people can tell me I'm just entirely crazy because I'm not on the ground.
No, I
But
just want checks and balances. That's
Yeah.
all. That I think checks and balances are really important as well.
Well, I meant less around the enabling legislation and more around the recovery task force, to bring local knowledge back up to central, to tell central government what needs to be fixed. Hope that it looks like the kind of structure that responds to the kinds of concerns that were raised after Christchurch, even if the emergency weather legislation, well, was a bit of a rush job.
Yeah, and I agree with you, and I think the idea of you know, reaching out and engaging with those parts of the community that you know, have got a deep knowledge about the land, the environment. You know, that's going to be absolutely critical, and the same with reaching out for traditional knowledge as well. And I think, you know, anyone that's had any doubts about the significance of involving mana whenua right at the front end of the decision making and the planning, you know, I mean, to me, it's, having been up to the Hawke's Bay, it's just, there is just no question that those big picture needs to involve everyone.
One of the bits that you pointed to in a recent column was the loss of local knowledge that we had with the abolition of the old flood boards back in 1989.
Drainage boards.
Yeah. So I'd always, I've been familiar with the problem. I hadn't been seeing it through the local knowledge aspect, which is obvious when you stop to think about it. So I'll step back for a second for those who haven't been following these debates as much as we have. So local government reforms in the 1980s amalgamated into councils a whole pile of functions that had been done by little special purpose governments in advance of that. So from central government's viewpoint, they couldn't really understand why these things existed, what their functions were, what their purpose was, and then just lumped it all into central council responsibility. Now, when you stop to think about it, it wasn't automatically necessary that would mean the loss of local knowledge about flood and drainage issues, because you could have imagined council saying, okay, well, we have to deal with this. Let's get the people who are on that flood board onto a little task force for us and make sure that we retain that. But that didn't seem to happen. It seemed to have been lost. The other problem that we'd seen with it is it wasn't just the local knowledge aspect that you brought in, massively important, but it wasn't just that. Those local boards also had the ability to raise debt that was backed by a special levy on the affected properties. So if a community said, well, we've got a drainage issue and we would like to fix it, and we'll all be happy to pay an extra special rate on our properties to be able to fix it, well, the drainage board could issue debt and everybody just pay for it over 20, 30 years until the thing's paid off. That mechanism both identified problems at the local level and let local communities come to the solution to it without having it have to go to council main balance sheet. And I wonder if we could start thinking about re-enabling those as parts of the solutions to dealing with more frequent weather events like this.
Yeah, look, it's an area that I'm not, you know, I don't have an in-depth knowledge of, but it does occur to me that when we have significant restructuring, we do lose local knowledge. We do lose institutional knowledge. And I think that it is vital that there is sort of almost like a single source of truth. What I have learned over the years is that with stormwater and with our river networks, that the knowledge of how the well, because it's not infrastructure. You see, after the earthquakes, we'd naturalized a lot of our stormwater functions. So they're not pipes in the ground, they're culverts, they're streams, and they lead into rivers. They go through wetlands in many instances to clean them up before they go into the rivers. So so there's all of these things, but each individual catchment needs its own you need a knowledge base around each catchment. And I'm kind of seeing that repeated. And I think in one of my articles I wrote that I talked to a landscape architect. We walked across Porritt Park after the earthquakes, and she was just looking at the land deformation, which was all to do with what was there before. And she was the one who said to me that you can pipe it, you can cover it, you can concrete it, you can divert it, but the memory of the stream remains in the land. And the land will always behave in a way, in a seismic event like that, and in a flood event, it will find all of the natural tributaries that were there before, when it can't go along the path that it was diverted to. So, you know, it's not rocket science, but I think we do need to understand better, catchment by catchment, what is, you know, what are the challenges, what are the opportunities, but also what are the impacts of climate change, for example, in the future as well, as we go through all of these issues. So yes, as the small institutional knowledge, you know, repositories disappear, then we face additional challenges as a country.
I wonder if one of the reasons that this local knowledge gets lost is that under the current way that we run some of our other institutions, there's less reason to keep it. Like in a big picture sense, you absolutely want to have it, but in the micro sense, the incentives are broken. So I think about, for example, I live on a rock in Kandala. We were consulting all of the geotech reports before we bought here when we moved to Wellington, because I was terrified from my experience in Christchurch. There was no way I wanted to be on anything that was less than the safest land you could find in Wellington, conditional on being in Wellington. My house pays the same insurance premium as a house would in Petone, that were worth the same amount of money. EQC charges based on the value of your house, not based on the underlying risk. Now,
EQC doesn't charge on the value of your house.
Well, up to a cap, right? So
yeah, no, it's a straight cap. So
yeah.
So I'm going to agree with you about the insurance, but not with you about EQC. EQC cover is, yes, it covers now a slightly larger amount. I think is it 250,000.
It's gone up.
The first 250,000 of the repair or replacement of your house. But the key with EQC is that it covers land damage.
Yep.
Now insurance doesn't. So and that's going to be the difference again between the North Island and the South Island is in an urban setting, a lot of the land was covered. A lot of the land that was red zoned was covered by EQC, so thereby their reinsurers. That's not going to be the case with vast tracts of farmland. So I don't agree that the EQC component of your insurance levy, that is not going to be the disincentive that I think you think that it's going to be. I think that insurance is already applying an element of differential based on what they are able to know. So it's, I mean, I'm not an insurance expert either, but I kind of get the risk analysis that they go through in order to assess what the premiums are going to be. So I don't think that it's as straightforward as you think it is. But insurance, I'll give you an example. In Christchurch, after the earthquakes, so sometime later, I became the mayor in 2013. In 2014, we had a series of floods that impacted in the Flockton area. So it flooded 3 times. So, you know, people got sick of hearing me saying 1 in 200 year events because they happened all the time. And but what we saw was that the insurance market simply responded to that reality, and they increased premiums, and they also increased the excess. So a family was being confronted with a $10,000 excess And so that is the reality of the model. And in fact, one that exists now for insurance, the EQC component of it would be negligible. So in the overall scheme of things, it wouldn't drive the particular result that you're asking for. But insurance companies aren't going to act without actual evidence upon which they can base the differential. So they're not going to go out and do land assessments all around the country. So if you can see what I mean, it's not, yeah.
Well, okay. I completely agree with you on farmland. EQC doesn't cover that, obviously. Within urban environments, though, the land component is going to be huge relative to the capital component in a lot of places, and the cost of remediating land is going to be pretty substantial if you're looking at a place like Petone, where you've got liquefaction risk as well as potential tsunami risk, right?
Yeah.
So at least in the literature on US flood insurance, you find that the empirical work shows it strongly encourages people to build on floodplains, and not just to build on floodplains, but to rebuild houses to the same kind of cruddy old spec that doesn't account for the underlying risk.
The Resource Management Act was responsible for that. The Resource Management Act has got a provision in it, and it's going with the new regime for existing use rights. And for existing use rights could top the risk. So it's some of our regulatory frameworks are actually the disincentive, not the EQC payment.
Yeah, it still feels like the lack of a risk gradient across properties. Well, you've got trade-offs, right? So you can either try to encourage people to mitigate those risks by saying, well, if you're going to build in this area, you must use method X and to standard Y.
We do.
Yeah,
we do
that's
do
how
that.
We have handled it, and it has been reasonably blunt. Sometimes it doesn't work all that well, and I worry that approach could become more almost more coercive as we get towards the bigger risks that are coming and communities facing really hard choices around sea level rise. An alternative would be to rely more on insurance, and people saying, well, do you want to pay really high insurance premiums to continue living here because that reflects the actual underlying risk? Or do you want to up sticks and leave it more to communities to decide? So
how do they get out of that? You know, I mean, look, I can look at an empty piece of land on a coastline, undeveloped, and I can say that is easy because we just won't build there. But what do I do when I look at a whole suburb, a seaside suburb, low-lying, flood-prone city? And I'm not just talking about Christchurch, I'm talking about cities around the world. Not everyone who has built in particular areas have done so knowing the potential risk that they might be facing in the future. How do we manage ourselves from a position of not knowing or having built not knowing, and then how do we manage into the future? And that's that third leg of the RMA reform trifecta, which I think is very important. That's the climate change adaptation, which is intended, as I understand it, to address some of the aspects of managed retreat. So because there is going to be a cost of managed retreat. How do you manage retreat? I mean, the red zoning wasn't a managed retreat, it was an unmanaged retreat. It was just here is a line in the sand and you can stay if you want to, but if you want to stay, then there's nothing guaranteed to you, and your property's going to have no value because we're going to buy out everyone else. So, yeah.
I've got a few ideas on how that could be handled, but not something that we can take on in the next 15 minutes or so. But we'll save it for another conversation, maybe.
Well, there is an idea, and that is that you could literally, the only person that you could sell the land to could be to either a government agency or a local government agency, or to the local government or to the government. You could sell the land and they could then rent it while it's, they could earn an income off it. until it was time to formalise a retreat, and then it would ultimately be restored to conservation land, I would imagine. But if you see what I mean, like yes, there is a way of addressing all of these issues, but I think we need to be talking about that now.
Oh, agree on that. Pre-planning it and having it set up well in advance so that we know what the best mechanism to use. That makes sense rather than doing it after the emergency. For a bit more on how I was thinking about this, I'd had a column called Managing Our Own Retreat. I think it was a newsroom a few weeks back, just looking at what I was seeing as a better option. But what I really wanted to ask you about is your work with the Resilient Cities Network. And you talked in one column about Grantham, and there's a city in Queensland that decided, or a town in Queensland that decided that, well, they wanted to move. How did they come to that decision, and what was the process around it?
Well, it was actually quite fortuitous that it was actually the mayor in the town that decided that they were going to reinstate the same risk if they built back on the low side of the river. They really needed to build up. So as I understand it, he talked to some people who were willing to sell a big tract of land. He negotiated with the Queensland Reconstruction and Recovery Authority, or whatever it was called at the time. It's still in existence today, by the way. And they were able to make it work, but it only worked for those people who were deemed by their insurance companies to be rebuilds, because people who were only going to repair their houses didn't have the financial contribution from their insurance companies that they needed to build on the higher ground. And guess what? The people on the higher ground, they were able to survive the last set of floods, but the people on the ground level were not. So, it was the right thing to do. Should the state or the government of the day stepped in to make it possible for all of the ones that were in harm's way to be shifted at the time, there is no better funded time from a central government point of view when you've got insurance paying for at least some of it. And that's a comment I've made on the West Coast as well.
Yeah, and that again makes the case for getting some of these frameworks set well in advance. So come the event, you're not scrambling to come up with the framework to take advantage of the opportunity. You've already had proper deliberation about it ahead of time. Yeah. The other lesson that we'd taken from the Christchurch experience was trying to avoid regime uncertainty. And what we mean by that as economists is that when it's unclear what the rules are going to be going forward, it's really hard for families to decide how to plan the rest of their lives, and for businesses to decide whether to invest in place, whether to move, how to arrange their affairs. Some of the pre-planning can help to remove regime uncertainty. And I really like that aspect. One argument in favor of the red zoning that did happen was that it helped to avoid some of that regime uncertainty for those families. Once the decision was made, well, okay, they can get on with their lives. And I at least know some of my friends that were in the red zone, oh God, I want to take the money and just get out of there. And that seemed to work for them. How do you sort of balance those things?
Well, it is a balance. There's a balance between deliberation and speed. That is always the case in a post-disaster environment. I think the primary consideration, or the sort of line at the bottom of the page, when you added up everything that needed to be done in those really severely damaged suburbs, it was how long that people were going to be out of their houses for. And, the government of the day said that it was likely that in the most damaged areas, they were going to be out of their houses for 5 years, and that was not sustainable. So yes, I'm agreeing with you. And I have to say that having become the mayor of Christchurch since the time of the red zoning, and I was red zone myself, so I always disclose that. But it was from a mayor's point of view, it was the best flood resilience plan that could have been put in place for the city. So the city no longer had to worry about what would happen in flood events for all along the Otakaro Avon River. And that was a huge advantage for the city. So, but again, the government used the fact that there was considerable funding available, not just from insurance companies, but also from EQC land cover. And that was the benefit of having a standard land cover over the area. It really did, I think, help them fund what was a substantial retreat decision.
Yeah, it wasn't just the retreat from the flood-prone areas, though, right? So other friends lived in the Avoca Valley and were very keen on being able to pay for some mitigation works. They thought that, so again, just for background, the Avoca Valley faced rockfall risk. So the Port Hills rock could tumble down if there were substantial future aftershocks. In the view of government, it was untenable for people to voluntarily accept that risk. In the view of some of the people living there, at least, the costs of mitigation works were far lower than the cost of moving everybody, and they loved living in their houses. So they were stuck in a period of regime uncertainty while that litigation went on for years, and it was pretty traumatic. How do we start thinking about those kinds of balancing issues where people want to bear their own risks, primarily at their own expense, but then council doesn't think it's tenable? So, because we will get into that again with sea level rise issues, right? Where communities facing frequent inundations, somebody might say, well, this is my summer batch, and if it floods once a decade, I'm happy with that. Why are you trying to make me move?
No, we said that this is where I think we do need to do some serious thinking about how we manage, because a retreat decision might in fact be made a long time before it needs to be implemented. But it's just what you do in the meantime in order to fund the alternative, because, you know, it is difficult saying to somebody that, you know, your whole family's grown up here, and now we're saying that it's not a good place to live in the future. So I think there's a lot of thinking that needs to go into that. In terms of the rockfall, cliff collapse, mass land movement, these were the issues that I inherited when I became the mayor. But there had been an agreement reached with central government. So the council took a slightly different position from the government. And that was that if rockfall protection could be put in place, and the cost of the rockfall protection was you know, no more than the cost of buying them out, then we would rather put in the rockfall protection. And we did that with a number of communities. So there were a number of communities that were red zoned as a result of rockfall risk, who subsequently put in rockfall protection and were able to remain. And that designation was taken off. Oh, no, and actually the underlying designation may not have been taken off because the rockfall protection would have to be maintained.
Yeah, I think some of those properties that were taken under those provisions are now being sold again.
Yeah.
News on that came out in the last couple of weeks, which introduces other interesting issues when you're kind of forced to sell your property and then council sells it off later. How do you think about any difference?
Oh, no, that yeah, okay, yeah, no, that I don't, I haven't caught up with all of that. That's happened since. Yeah, no, I agree with you, and I've always thought that even though when we signed for the red zone offer, when we signed, we gave up any right of first refusal if the land was subsequently sold. I always felt that, you know, that if the council had been in the position to do something about that, they would offer it back to where it came from. Yeah, no, I did read that article. Sorry. Yeah.
Cool. We've got about 15 minutes left. I'm not seeing any questions yet in the chat window. If anybody had some, they can feel free to type them in now. If there's directions you want us to be taking the conversation in that you've been frustrated that we haven't gone in, please let us know. Otherwise, we'll yammer on a little bit more. From what you've been seeing, though, what have been the big lessons that government has taken on in the current response to the cyclones?
Well, I think the task force approach has been a very powerful message to the regions that they are to supply information through, that the government is going to be looking at it on a region by region basis. And I think even having the the different ministers providing a leadership role and then bringing that back to the cabinet table, I think that's very good. I was asked by the chair of the Hawke's Bay Regional Council to go up and give them a bit of a talk about recovery lessons. And so I took a group of people that had originally been involved in coming and talking in Christchurch about recovery very early on. And they had some really important messages. They were things like, how am I going to put it? That there were things like, that recovery is very complex. It's not linear. It's not straightforward. You'll take one step forward, but then you'll take two steps back. It's really important to celebrate milestones, but you've also got to be realistic with people. You've got to let people know what you know, let people know what you don't know, and let people know when you will know more. That all of these little tips. We also had someone from the health system come and talk about the reality of confronting what is a life-threatening event, and the fear and the stress that can cause in your life, and being open and aware of that is a really good way of helping people cope, but also restoring a sense of agency within communities is a big step forward towards helping people become coping communities again. And the other thing was how important it is to really to what we called them in Christchurch were sort of community hubs, where there would be a place where people could go, and anyone would be there that have a representative of insurance, that have a representative of EQC, and there were no wrong doors. You could ask anyone anything, and they would connect you to the right place. And they're incredibly valuable people called community navigators. And I'm recommending that they get these in place up in the North Island as well as soon as possible. Community navigators are the people that they might be funded by central and local government or regional government, but they are not employed by them. They become really community advocates, navigators, people who know how to connect you to the right people. Again, it's really to facilitate getting answers to questions, because often after a disaster, the worst thing is the not knowing and, sort of not knowing when to expect whatever might be happening. So, I mean, my heart really goes out to the people up in that area. Yes. Because they're going to go through a tough time. But there are some very simple things that we did down here that would be really helpful in my view. So one of the good things that the government's already done is to put in place the insurance tribunal service, whatever it's called. Sorry, I can't remember the name of it, but they've put it in place already. That took years to come in Christchurch, but they know that it's going to be a problem, so they put it in straight away.
Yeah, for me, I've also really appreciated the change in approach to the task force and trying to harness local knowledge more. The things I particularly appreciated are the things that I haven't been hearing. So new development units, precincts, anchor projects, not hearing any of that. I like that. I don't
Me
think
too.
those were a good approach. Now, we are seeing a few questions coming through. The first one, I think, is from Donald, and he asks, in light of the Christchurch's experience, do you feel that pre-quake physical infrastructure had been built to an adequately resilient standard? And what sort of event-proofing level of resilience should we now be aiming for?
So I think it's important to remember two things. One is that the September earthquake, I think, gave us more of an opportunity to understand what our risks were, and we did not protect sufficiently against what happened in February. So there were buildings that ought to have been protected from falling. This is unreinforced masonry buildings that fell, or properly cordoned, so there were no people walking in front of them or actually walking in and out of them. So that was a big mistake, and I apologized for that formally on behalf of the city as part of the apology that I made. So that's one type of thing, and I think that we need to take earthquake prone buildings way more seriously than we're taking them in very seismically exposed areas of New Zealand, and perhaps I might think of Wellington as one of them. I think we need to make decisions about what buildings we want to protect and what buildings we will let go, because I'd rather let them go than have people killed. So I do think that we need to take earthquake-prone buildings more seriously than we are. There have been considerable changes since the earthquakes, and it is much better than it was, but I still think there is still quite a bit of work to do. There were buildings in the earthquake, the Kaikoura Huranui earthquake, that affected Wellington buildings that should never have been affected. So I've never understood the detail behind that, but brand new buildings were essentially pulled down because of the damage that was done during the earthquake. And the other group of buildings is that there were buildings that were taken down because they were in the wrong place for the blueprint, not because they needed to be pulled down. So and I'll never ever understand that or agree with it.
Yeah, agree. I wonder if the question was looking a little bit more at things like physical infrastructure, overpasses, bridges, water infrastructure, resilience that way. I know in Wellington, they are at least trying to get a more resilient water supply so that come the event, that'll be fixed. They seem to have been a bit more forward-looking about it because the risk is more palpable here. On the other side, we still do have problems with heritage-listed buildings that are very difficult to make earthquake safe. And councils think that they're trying to list another.
They're very costly to make earthquake safe, and that's potentially the bigger issue. And I think we need to decide whether they should be, whether they should. Yeah, we need to make some decisions.
I think on those ones, at least when it comes to heritage buildings, we need to shift it from being an off-budget expenditure for councils through regulatory provisions and shift it to being an on-budget expenditure where they just pay owners of buildings for maintaining them to an adequate heritage standard if they are worth it. And then that forces balancing of priorities. Another question that's come in from Aish, interested to hear your views on emergency legislation in response to a natural disaster being passed under urgency with minimal to no time for public input, noting that the submissions were open for less than a day. I've got some views on that, but I'll let you go first.
Well, I was overseas on that day. I still managed to get a submission in, but look, it's not ideal. So, and it's exactly what I was saying to Eric earlier on, was that there is a lot of work that could have happened after the same thing happened in Christchurch. They could have actually worked out which pieces of legislation they could amend on a primary amendment basis so that you didn't have this need to pass this under urgency. So I think that I think they did hear loudly and clearly from people that, that this requires somebody else made a submission that suggested that it would be a good idea for Parliament to actually to basically review. And I know that the Regulations Review Committee reviews, but I think Parliament itself should review the decisions, and that might be the check and balance this time. But I don't think we should let this happen again. No.
Yeah, our submission. Well, we got an email at like 9 o'clock the night before submissions were due at 5 o'clock the next afternoon saying that, well, submissions are due. Here's your chance to read the legislation and say something about it. We'd focused.
Well, you couldn't read the Hansard. There was, I was overseas, so I was reading it at a wrong time frame anyway. So it was probably while you were asleep, but the link was down, so I could not read what the minister and others had said about it.
So our submission similarly focused on this should have been planned well in advance. You should get this properly planned out next time well in advance. This kind of submissions process is a farce. Like you can't have deliberation in this kind of an interval. You might need to have hasty emergency responses in future, but it should be around legislation that has been set well in advance with appropriate deliberation to avoid these kinds of problems. Yeah. So we were pretty unhappy about it, and we hope that we don't have to see this kind of thing again. We're hitting into the final minutes. Anything else you'd like to leave Lianne's attendees with? Sorry? Oh, no.
Look, I think that, when we go through a disaster, there are always opportunities that emerge. And I think that, we've focused on some of the negative side of things, but there are enormous opportunities that come with disaster. It actually gives us the opportunity to address some of the things that we didn't think we could address before. It gives us some opportunities to embed a deeper sense of resilience, both from an environmental level, but also from a community level. Communities come together after disasters. They always do. And that can be built on. There is no going back pre that event to the way things were. So, taking control of what a new normal looks like, and that can be an incredibly powerful experience. And so, I'm sort of urging those that have been through that experience up in the North Island to keep looking for those opportunities. There are huge challenges in front of you, though, and I don't want to underestimate that. I have said to people, go and look at what happened in Queensland, because some of the things that happened in Christchurch aren't going to be the same. We weren't large tracts of farmland being affected, so the primary industry's role is going to be huge. What's going to help get an economic recovery going in these particular regions when there's going to be no going back to normal anytime soon for the standard primary sector? I mean, somebody was saying recently how long it takes to grow a new apple orchard. I mean, the challenges are enormous. But what could we do? What could we as New Zealanders do? Because I think everyone's behind the affected regions, and I think we want our government to basically be supporting these regions to get back on their feet, even partially back on their feet, so that they can think about what that future holds in terms of the new normal, whatever that might look like. So, huge challenges, but I'd like to leave a note of optimism for the opportunities that lie ahead as well.
And when that thinking about the new normal is led by the local community, I think you wind up with a lot fewer of the kinds of problems where, in my view, at least in Christchurch, it felt like central government was playing Sim City, where you push the pause button between turns. You think that everybody's lives are going to be on hold while you redesign everything, and you really don't give much of a hoot about the cares of the Sims that are involved. And that leads to a lot of those problems of regime uncertainty where you just can't tell what's going to be allowed because it wasn't coming from the local community. So it's great that at least in this case, they seem to be driven more from the needs of the local community. Thank you so much, Lianne. This has been great fun. I've enjoyed this conversation. Thank you, Brett, for putting this together for us. I'll pass over to Brett for any concluding bits.
Well, no, just to say thank you both very much. It's a great conversation and a really different format for us. So you really great to hear your insights and learnings from deep experience. So great, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you,
Brett. Thank you, attendees.
Cheers.
Bye.